Okay, thanks very much. Um, it's an honor to be here. Thank Jürgen for inviting me very much. Um, I thought he never would invite me because of a dismal dinner in Tucson that I think you could say he detested. But anyway, he forgave me for being with the dinner party, and I thank him for that. So I want to talk today about the problem of consciousness and give a kind of catalog of different ways of looking at it, a traditional catalog. So let me share my screen. Okay, so before we get to the catalog, let's talk about the problem of consciousness. And a, a question that might puzzle you is why is there a problem of consciousness at all? Uh, if you take I think, an intuitive viewpoint, there's nothing more obvious. And in fact, in a way, there could not be anything more obvious than the existence of consciousness and that we have directly accessible qualities of consciousness. And maybe later tonight, you can try an experiment to verify this. Uh, I call it the two martini experiment. So consume two martinis quite rapidly, and you will notice something. One, your consciousness remains in existence. And two, you can directly tell that there is a difference in the quality of your consciousness. Hopefully a rather delightful difference. Of course, have a few more martinis and consciousness might disappear. Um, everything, all of the stories we tell each other, write about, are, I think, ultimately about our consciousness, the nature of human consciousness and human experience. And I think all of our knowledge ultimately stems from our consciousness and come from the fact that we have access to it. So I think that should be quite clear. So what is the problem about consciousness? Uh, well, there's a problem because we unfortunately forgot something. We forgot that there is also a problem of matter, the material world. And we've come to think that consciousness is weird and strange, but the material world is not. The material world is pedestrian, ordinary, not strange. Um, and this is actually, I think, a mistake. Um, the view I talked about on the last slide is that this naive, rejected, and forgotten attitude to consciousness as a directly accessible aspect of nature has turned into the view we take with regards to matter, which we know because of consciousness. I think this is a rather strange reversal. Why has this reversal happened? Well, I think the reason is that the attitudes that we've taken to both consciousness and the material world really depend on certain ideas, and maybe more important, because the ideas have changed so much, but the ideals of 17th century physics. So the invention of physics and the invention of physical science gave us a picture of matter, but that I think we're still beholden to, even though what we know about matter has changed radically over the last 400 years. So what is this picture of matter that we inherit? Well, basically, we have been given a picture where matter is made of hard, massy, movable bits and pieces that when they aggregate together become visible to us. Matter is passive, responds only sullenly to forces, and ideally only to the force of impact. You can remember the mechanical picture of nature. Nature is made of small bits of matter interacting by contact forces. And that was it, supposedly. It is a really simple picture. It's remote from reality, but it is a nice picture. This a set of bits and pieces moving together, interacting by contact forces, is entirely devoid of mentality. The little atoms are mindless. They obey only some range of physical law. So the picture is really like the world is made of little Lego blocks fitting together in various ways. The Legos have different shapes, so they can fit together to produce all sorts of stuff. And they're interacting like billiard balls, bouncing around off each other. And that's it. And so you think, well, that's easy to understand. There's no puzzle about matter. Now, the modern physics has completely overturned this picture. And you could go a long way into how quantum physics moves away from the mechanical picture, but that's not what I think matters. What matters more is how that the new physics is explained to people and the picture that's given. So here, there's a quote from David Wallace. The popular impression of particle physics as about the behavior of little point particles whizzing about bears about as much relation to real particle physics as the earth, air, fire, water theory of matter bears to the periodic table. So modern physics is quite different, but if you read popular physics books, the picture is remarkably similar to the old picture. You've got a very few kinds of very small things obeying only four forces. So it's not just contact. You have the strong and the weak, etc. forces, but it's a very small number, and it's acting over very small things. And of course, these things are completely devoid of any mental properties. In fact, they really need to have only quite a small number of basic properties. Things like mass, charge, spin, etc. And that's about it. Now, if you have a picture like that, then you're going to think, oh, I understand how the physical world works. Not in detail, of course, it's complicated, but I see how it works in general. And that picture is going to generate the problem of consciousness, I think, inevitably. But I think it was most clearly recognized in the 19th century. Goes back before then. You could, of course, Descartes recognized the problem of consciousness. But Descartes could separate mind and matter quite happily. But as science grew in its understanding of the material world, it became harder and harder to maintain this separateness. And by the 19th century, you get a very clear understanding there's a serious problem here. So here's some representative quotations. Dubois-Raymond in 1872 says, we cannot, by means of any imaginable movement of material particles, bridge over the chasm between the conscious and the unconscious. Huxley has, I think, the most beautiful version. He says that how it is that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as a result of irritating nervous tissue is just as unaccountable as the appearance of the jinn when Aladdin rubbed his lamp. And the same idea from Tyndall, but a little more ponderously. Tyndall says, granted that a definite thought and a definite molecular action in the brain occurs simultaneously, we do not possess the intellectual organ, nor apparently any rudiment of the organ, which would enable us to pass by a process of reasoning from the one to the other. I can't resist a little footnote. My own university, the University of Toronto, around this time, 1865, had a job on offer, and two of the candidates were Huxley and Tyndall. And my university decided neither was up to the mark, and instead hired the nephew of the then premier of the province. Well, hopefully things have changed. Anyway, the whole history of the mind problem, mind-body problem, I think, is the history of this problem of consciousness. So now let's turn and look at this history of the mind-body problem in all the ways, or a large number of the ways philosophers have addressed them. Oh, okay, before doing that, forgot about this slide. Here's somebody, and it became more obvious at the beginning of the 20th century, I think, that there really are two mysteries here: the mystery of consciousness and the mystery of matter. If we think about consciousness, we think about the source of knowledge, source of meaning, source of value, and we think it's immediately accessible. Matter, on the other hand, is supposed to be this dead, mechanical driving force. It causes everything that actually happens, knowable, but only via its effects on consciousness. And if you look at it this way, consciousness seems to be only arbitrarily related to matter. And in fact, it looks like it's entirely superfluous. But on the other hand, I would hold consciousness is the most important thing in the universe. Matter is the side of emptiness, intrinsic worthlessness, and its nature is inaccessible. This is this double mystery. Arthur Eddington expressed the problem of matter by writing, something unknown is doing we don't know what. Okay, so now let's turn to the catalog. There's going to be a whole bunch of theories. Here's a kind of map of theories of the mind or consciousness. Now, you could draw this map in many ways, and it is a crude chart as labeled. There are lots of places where you could argue to rearrange things or argue there should be entirely different categories. So you'll see immediately I divide it into monism and dualism. Well, philosophers have an awful lot of trouble counting above two. So theories generally have divided in this direction. There are pluralist views, but even those immediately privilege the two forms, monism or dualism. Okay, let's think about how this goes and roughly speaking, following the history. Let's start with dualism. It should be familiar from your old school days, I think, back when school actually taught substance. Dualism comes in many forms. The most famous is the Cartesian form, and the Cartesian form is called interactive substance dualism. What are substances? This is a large philosophical question. Basically, substance is the stuff the world is made out of, whatever it might be. I guess officially the definition of substance is that which can exist without the aid of anything else. Let me say without the metaphysical aid of anything else. Causation is another story. So traditionally, for Descartes, mind and matter are the two kinds of substance because those are the two things that could exist on their own. God, if he wanted to, could destroy all matter and leave the minds in existence. He could destroy all minds and leave matter in existence, right? But he could not destroy all matter and leave, for example, red things in existence. Red, the attribute of red depends on matter metaphysically. Descartes said, okay, there's two the substances, mind and matter. He identified mind as consciousness. And totally following common sense, Descartes argued that the two substances causally interact. Everybody would intuitively agree with this. Obviously, if I stick my finger into a flame, I will feel pain. And my feeling of pain makes me move my finger. What could be more obvious? But if they're actually distinct substances, how could they interact? In response to this problem, there had to be new versions of the theory created. And you'll start to see foliations of dualism in the face of this kind of problem. The problem was noticed immediately after Descartes wrote, and one of the most insightful criticisms comes from the Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, here taking on the costume of Diana the Huntress. She and Descartes had a correspondence. She was a very, very smart woman, gifted in geometry and also philosophy. And she wrote to Descartes and said, you know, the one question I would most like an answer is how the immaterial mind can cause movement in the purely material body. And Descartes wrote back saying, hey, this is the best question anybody's ever asked me. And the answer is, there is no answer. Descartes' official answer was, it is a primitive fact, which is inexplicable. It was instituted by God, and that is that. The princess was not very satisfied. She wrote back with further critique, and Descartes then said, it is time now to switch to geometry. And they discussed mathematics for the rest of the correspondence. Now, this problem remained. It seems entirely intractable, and Descartes' solution seems very unsatisfactory. If you think about the idea that the physical world will have these sudden bursts of activity coming from nowhere, apparently, it's just not a very nice picture. Leibniz has his famous solution, pre-established harmony, which borrows the idea from Descartes that God institutes the connection between mind and matter, but just denies the causation part, right? So instead, the two realms of mind and matter are perfectly synchronized, but they're causally independent. And Leibniz's favorite analogy was two clocks. Two clocks built by the master clockmaker, keeping time together perfectly, never needing adjustment. They will always keep time, but not because they are causally connected, just because they're keeping perfect time. I've always wondered, one of Leibniz's teachers was Huygens, and Huygens actually studied how pendulum clocks would synchronize themselves through mechanical connection. So if you put two pendulum clocks on the same wall, they will synchronize by very subtle influences. The image is very similar, but also totally at odds. It requires causal connection. Pre-established harmony is borrowed or independently discovered by Spinoza. It is also not very satisfactory. It is an arbitrary imposition, and philosophers continue to seek other ways around this difficulty. And here we get a possible important distinction between substance dualism and property dualism, which is really taking us on the road to monism. The idea here is you could have one substance in the world, but it could have significantly different kinds of properties. And in particular, you could divide properties into physical properties and mental properties. This is still a position that's held in the present day, and it leads to a variety of issues, some of them very deep. There's also maybe worth mentioning a metaphysical issue about, can you really distinguish substance and property? And I want to make a distinction only at a rather superficial level. That is to say, in the sense that one thing can change its properties, we can talk about substances and their properties as distinct. But I don't mean to imply that there's some conception of propertyless substance, something like prime matter. I'm not making any such claim here. It's a very simpler picture. Just we can imagine, basically there's one kind of substance. It can have a variety of properties, and there might be very important distinctions among those properties, particularly mental and physical. So if you take this kind of property dualist picture, there are various ways you can consider the linkage. And one classic way is epiphenomenalism. One of its proponents, Thomas Huxley, we've already seen in the quote I gave above. So the view is the world is one substance and it's matter. Kind of you give privilege to the material properties of the world. But material things have more than purely physical properties. They have mental properties as well, consciousness properties. Now, there's an issue here. The physical world is supposed to be causally closed, which means every physical event that happens has a purely physical sufficient cause. Why would you believe that? Well, there's lots of reasons. One might be, for example, the idea that the world obeys principles of conservation. And if you imagine intrusions from a non-physical property causally affecting the world, then these conservation principles will be threatened. If you imagine Descartes, remember Descartes? Uh, Descartes' picture, he said, okay, the mind and the body interact. And in fact, he believed they interacted at a particular point in the brain, the pineal gland, in fact. If you took your microscope and you opened somebody's skull and you watched carefully the pineal gland, it would sometimes wiggle for no reason. When the person was trying to do something, like raise their arm, the pineal gland would suddenly wiggle for no apparent physical reason. Now, this would appear to be an introduction of energy out of nowhere. And that would be very unsatisfying, physically unsatisfying. So Huxley says, okay, I believe in causal closure. The physical world is this complete, hermetically sealed causal system. There are mental properties, though. We can tell. We're conscious. We know it. So the mental properties, therefore, must be physically inefficacious. They are an admittedly magnificent, but mysterious and purely decorative efflorescence bursting out of the physical world. It's great that they're here, but they don't do anything. This, of course, is highly unintuitive and introduces a very bizarre causal asymmetry. So the material world gets to produce this wonderful stuff, but the wonderful stuff just sits there. Right? It also raises a kind of deep philosophical problem. How come introspection of consciousness is accurate? When I say I feel a pain, my words are caused by purely physical things. It's just a matter of luck, as it were, metaphysical luck, that's associated with a pain as opposed to some other sensation that I'm aware of. The whole idea that I'm aware of consciousness becomes threatened inside this picture. So epiphenomenalism has very few defenders in the modern, at the current time. It does have some, of course. I don't think there's any philosophical position that doesn't retain a few able, in fact, defenders. However, there's an alternative to epiphenomenalism, and it's an idea that has lots of proponents. It's a rather exciting idea, but it becomes less exciting the more you examine it, I think, without disappearing. This is emergentism. Real emergentism is a matter of genuine ontological novelty. It agrees that the material world generates consciousness. You have the efflorescent mental properties. But what if these new mental properties acted back on matter? So, and this kind of emergentism was very popular in the first quarter century of the 20th century, roughly, until about 1925, which is a significant date. for the fortunes of emergentism. Anyway, the claim is under certain conditions, under certain physical conditions, absolutely new unpredictable properties emerge and they affect the physical dynamics. Now, you've got to be very careful when you think about emergentism because there is nothing more common than new properties appearing when matter joins together into new configurations, and for those new properties to make a kind of difference. But mostly this turns out to be what is called epistemic emergence. That is, we don't understand fully how these new properties appear, but we don't think they're actually interfering with the basic causal laws of basic physics. What would be an example? High temperature superconductivity, take a purely physical example. We don't really understand how it works. It is a real property and it emerges only when matter gets under rather specific and strange conditions. Only certain kinds of chemical compounds, usually very quite low temperatures, not as low as some, and usually under exceptionally high pressure. So do we have a good theory of this? No. Do we think it violates the laws of basic physics? No, we do not. Ontological emergence, this kind of genuine ontological novelty, does present something that is both inexplicable and is going to make some kind of violation of the basic laws of physics. Perhaps not a very large one, but it would be real. So said these emergentists anyway. If you look around the world, well, where is this ontological emergence? Now, before 1925, people like Morgan said, well, there's an obvious example, chemistry. Nobody could ever have predicted the chemical properties of a substance just from the properties of its chemical constituents. Take oxygen and hydrogen, you put them together, you get water. Morgan says, look, there's no theory that explains why it ends up being a liquid at ordinary pressures and temperatures. This was their linchpin main example. But in 1925, with the birth of modern quantum mechanics, it became less clear that chemical emergence was ontological emergence. People still debate about this, rather recondite debates, but more and more chemical properties are in fact being deduced from the underlying quantum mechanics. You can read papers. They're pretty old now. When I was looking at this a few years ago, people said, yeah, we can do ab initio calculations of the boiling point of water just from the quantum mechanics of oxygen and hydrogen. And we can get within, plus or minus 25 degrees. And they thought, yeah, that's pretty good. It's only a matter of getting better calculations to get it head on. And just today, I was reading of a new theory that is a quantum mechanical calculation of the high temperature superconductors. This is how science progresses. Yeah, there are these emergent properties. We presume there is some explanation of how they arise quite naturally out of the basic physical conditions. but we just don't yet understand it. That's not ontological, that's just epistemic. Consciousness does not seem to be a case where there's any hint of this explanatory pathway. Unlike in chemical properties, where you can kind of see how this works, consciousness properties seem to be, if anything, the real place where genuine ontological novelty would happen. But of course, it was supposed to be the prevalence of ontological emergence that made consciousness something acceptable. When you discover that it's only consciousness that is a candidate for ontological emergence, much of the attractiveness kind of disappears. There's another example. Life was thought to be an ontological emergent. People believed in vitalism, and there was some special property, the Elan Vital or something like that, that when a life formed out of the chemical organic compounds, it generated this new property. And of course, we don't really believe in that anymore either. We have a pretty good understanding of the chemical foundations of life. Well, if you don't have epiphenomenalism, if you don't have emergentism, pardon me, I'm getting over quite a bad viral infection, and the cough is lingering. If you don't have emergentism, you don't have epiphenomenalism. Is there some other way to explain in dualistic terms, in property dualistic terms, the place of consciousness? Yes, final option is panpsychism on this road. Now, panpsychism is the view that consciousness or mind is ubiquitous in nature and is a fundamental feature of the world. There is a natural argument for it, which goes back to the 19th century, has been reiterated in the 20th and 21st centuries. The argument is this: mind or consciousness, especially consciousness, is irreducible. Ontological emergence does not occur in the world, and therefore the mind is a fundamental feature of the world. Fundamental features are ubiquitous throughout nature, and therefore you get panpsychism. One way of thinking about this is sometimes called deferential panpsychism. Deferential panpsychism takes the physical picture of the world as given by physics and adds mental properties to the list of fundamental properties. So you have mass, charge, spin, and some kind of elemental consciousness. Not what we experience, of course. We're very high up in the complexity scale of consciousness. But the fundamental physical entities will have this elemental form of consciousness. And that means panpsychism faces the problem of mental chemistry. How would the elemental consciousness features join together to form more complex conscious states, such as the ones we enjoy? And no one has an answer to this question yet, but there are many proposals. An interesting proposal is integrated information theory, which is very popular at the moment. And it has a picture of how mental chemistry would work. Won't get into it. Okay, so that's the dualistic side of our diagram. Let's turn back to the simpler monistic side. Monism say, okay, there's only one kind of stuff in the world, But of course, the question is, well, what kind of stuff is it? And the answer, unsurprisingly, kind of parallels the dualistic picture. So one, probably the most popular philosophical theory at the present time, but I think decreasing in popularity. Its heyday was probably, oh, I know, the 80s, something like that. The most popular one says there's only one thing, only one kind of thing, and it is physical. This is called physicalism. Physicalism can come in various forms. Let's begin with why you would want to be a physicalist in the first place. I think the answer is pretty obvious. And it is the immense success of physical science. Pardon me. So since the 17th century, physical science has been on a unimpeded run of increased explanatory power and increasingly driven ever more remarkable technology. And this has had a very powerful influence on culture and intellectual life. This leads to the idea that it must be the case that everything real and concrete is physical. I add concrete only because of a purely philosophical worry about the existence of things like numbers and properties, the abstract entities, which no one really understands how to integrate into physicalism. The primary method is one that's also been applied to mind, and the primary method is to say, well, they don't exist at all. Everything real and concrete is physical, and eventually, science's explanatory scope will exhaustively encompass reality. In fact, you might ask, well, what does science fail to aspirationally explain? By aspirationally, I explain is phenomena that we have some notion of how we might physically understand it. So right now we say, oh, the world is mostly dark matter and dark energy, and we have no idea what they are. But of course, physicists have lots of ideas of what they might be and how they can look for them. So there is aspirational explanation for them. If you have this picture, of course, mind and consciousness have got to be purely physical phenomena somehow. By the way, the equation on the left is the Lagrangian for the standard model of physics. And you can see here how physics prizes simplicity above all. Well, this is as simple as it gets, and that doesn't even include gravity. Oh, well. Okay, if we're going to look at physicalism, the most basic form of it just says mind and matter are identical. And in particular, mind and brain, because we know that the brain is the seat of consciousness. We have abundant evidence for the importance of the brain and neural processes for consciousness. And one version of this, called the psychophysical identity theory, championed by a very, very famous Australian philosopher, J.C.C. Smart, smart by name and smart by nature. The natural argument for the psychophysical identity theory is this. First, mental states correlate with neural states. We have abundant evidence for this kind of correlation, not in full detail, but remarkable nonetheless. At the present day, we can put someone into a MRI machine, ask them to imagine various things, and be able to tell from the brain scan what they're imagining. It's perhaps only a matter of time till much more detailed decoding of mental processes is possible. So we know mental states correlate with neural states, and here's a significant premise. Mental states are causally efficacious. We had identity theorists endorse the causal efficacy of the mind in line with common sense. They also endorse the claim we saw before: the world is physically causally closed. There's no outside causal forces suddenly impinging. So mental states must be neural states. It's not an absolutely totally waterclad argument. It depends a little bit on Occam's razor. And in fact, put together, it has many virtues. It rescues the efficacy of the mind. It respects Occam's razor. It is simpler. It posits one kind of stuff instead of two. And I think most importantly in the minds of its defenders, it integrated minds into an exhaustively complete scientific picture of the world. You know, what's not to like? Well, it does have some serious deficiencies. And the deficiencies we'll talk about in a second lead to the second version of identity theory, or physicalism, called functionalism. Now, I said physicalism was the most popular current philosophical view of the mind-body relation. I think functionalism in particular is the form of physicalism that's most popular current form. Functionalism, strongly defended by one of the most important American philosophers of the 20th century, David Lewis, noted that there are difficulties with the psychophysical identity theory. It entails that non-neural systems lack minds. Lewis liked to talk about aliens. If you look at them, maybe you can see why. But anyway, aliens, let's imagine, as in many science fiction movies, alien creatures arrive. We discover that their internal workings are completely different than ours. You know, even more different than the way that octopuses are, or birds. Birds and octopi have very different brain organization than we do. They do still have neural states. These guys don't even have neurons. They have some other, who knows what system. Maybe their brains work by spintronics. PBT entails they don't have minds, no consciousness there. And that seems ridiculous. I mean, they built their spaceship. They're talking to us. It also means computers can't have minds, not unless we start building computers out of neural systems, which, by the way, we are at the moment. We're beginning to build computers out of neural organoids. But in general, good old-fashioned silicon computers cannot have minds. And this also seems unnecessarily stringent, right? Functionalism says the PPT misunderstood the nature of how minds are physical. What matters isn't the stuff you're made out of. What matters is the functional or organizational or causal structure. The physical form is what's called the implementation or the realization. And it led to this slogan, which I think sums it up perfectly. The mind is to the brain as software is to hardware. Well, the mind is a software structure running on the hardware of the brain. But the brain, as a particular organic system, is not what's really important. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine you have some terrible brain disease, your neurons are dying faster than normal, and doctor says, yeah, we discovered we can replace your neurons with electronic surrogates that have exactly the same input-output function. They will be connected to exactly the same neurons as their original target was, and they will project to the same neurons. And they will fire in exactly the same way. This will make no difference to your consciousness. Eventually, your whole brain is made out of these transistor neurons, and you've never noticed any difference. Functionalism holds, yeah, that's possible. Functionalism might hold more. It might say you could implement the brain purely in silicon software. Hence the dream of some that we could upload our minds onto computers and achieve immortality. No sign of that happening yet, but there are people who still hope for it. Now, is functionalism the last story? No, functionalism has a big problem, actually, in the very place it was supposed to help, and that's eliminativism about consciousness. How does functionalism actually explain the nature of experience? Philosophers sometimes use this word qualia for the quality of experience. You know, the redness of a rose when you look at it, the taste of beer when you taste it. I hope soon you'll be able to try that out. All of the qualities we prize in experience don't seem to have to do with the organizational structure of some underlying system. Why would a purely mechanical duplication of function entail the existence of conscious experience? How would we know, or why would it even be the case that functionally equivalent systems couldn't have diverse phenomenal or qualitative experience? There's a famous thought experiment about color inversion. You know, what if half of us see red the way the other half see green and vice versa? No one would ever know. Maybe we all see color differently. This doesn't seem to depend on functional organization. Now, what would be the solution to this? Well, in the 21st century, I believe as a recognition of how serious this problem is, have grown up philosophers who call themselves illusionists about consciousness. It is an illusion that we are aware of qualitative states of consciousness. We aren't really, we just think we're experiencing consciousness. We just believe that we're conscious, but we're not actually. At least not actually conscious in the sense that we have any qualitative experience. This is a very extreme view, and very few philosophers hold it. Daniel Dennett was one, I think. Illusionists are usually very cagey about, they say, oh, we're not really denying consciousness. we're denying something else. But when you read them, they appear to be denying that we have qualitative experience. There's another form of eliminativism, which makes illusionism even stranger. And this is eliminativism about mental states that are non-qualitative, belief and desire. And the idea here, made famous by the Canadian philosophers, Patricia and Paul Churchland, is that the idea or the concepts of beliefs and desires are antiquated holdovers from pre-scientific time, a pre-scientific time of benighted ignorance. And they should be eradicated, like the ancient idea of the humors, the ancient idea of the celestial spheres, the relatively recent idea of phlogistons, the also relatively recent idea of demons. These are all not misunderstandings. They're outright non-existent. They're errors where we postulate the existence of something that is completely unreal. And say the Churchlands, we should recast our self-conception in purely scientific terms. So you can't even really say, if you're an illusionist, that we only believe that we're conscious, because there aren't any beliefs. It's a difficult position. I hesitate to say to believe. It is difficult to believe that there are no beliefs, and in some sense, they're asking you to do this. So the view of illusionism and eliminativism, a very extreme view, which I think is a symptom of how serious the problem of consciousness is in the physicalist world view. So turning now quickly, I guess I'm running out of time, I hope not. There's another form of monism, naturally, which says everything is mind. There is only one kind of stuff, and it is mental. It is consciousness itself. Famously espoused by George Berkeley, who argued to be is to be perceived. And he asks us to try and prove him wrong. Try to conceive of an unexperienced reality. Go ahead, he says, imagine a tree that's unseen. Oh, wait a minute, I just saw it in my imagination. Well, that didn't work. Let me conceive of an invisible person. Wait a minute, I just conceived of it. So Berkeley's claim to be is to be perceived, and the world is nothing but a grand assembly of minds and nothing but minds. And the system of experiences of all the minds together is orchestrated, and you can guess by who, to appear to them as a coherent, integrated physical world. The problem of consciousness is solved because there only is consciousness. Idealism comes in various forms. I won't talk about in detail. You could say instead of many minds, there's only one. Absolute idealism. Hegel, perhaps. British idealists, Green and Bradley, etc. There's also famously from your country, transcendental idealism, which holds that while there might be a world behind experience, its form is governed by the nature of human consciousness and is otherwise completely unknowable. Now, there is another way of looking at this. What if you take the view that there is just one kind of stuff, and it is neither mind nor matter? Neither mind or matter. This is a view that rose to prominence at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, and then disappeared completely for quite a long time. I think it's making a comeback now in one form or another. Here's one form called neutral monism, championed by Bertrand Russell. There are his remarkable dates. Born when you only could move around by carriage and live to see the landing on the moon. Here's Russell. He says, the whole duality of mind and matter is a mistake. There's only one kind of stuff out of which the world is made, and it's just labeled. It's called mental in one arrangement. It's called physical in the other. Russell held that if what physical science does is describe only the structural patterns in the world, not what the world is in itself. The world in itself is this neutral stuff. The equations of physics just describe the connections or relations or patterns happening in this neutral stuff. But the patterns need something. Although I know Stephen Hawking hated philosophy, he did notice that you needed something to, as he put it, breathe fire into the equations. The equations sit there describing these patterns. Something has to instantiate the patterns. And Russell said, yeah, this neutral base gives rise equally to mind and matter as observable patterns within the neutral. There's another form. Russellian version has the neutral as a kind of mysterious third thing. As Eddington said, something unknown is doing we don't know what. This tends to lead to a panpsychist version. Eddington explicitly held to the panpsychist version where you say, okay, what is this intrinsic nature? And the answer is consciousness itself. And you head back towards idealism. William James, I think, more boldly took the neutral to be something which is directly accessible in what he called, misleadingly, pure experience. Pure experience is not mental, or at least James tried to argue. It's a difficult argument to make, that we have access to something that's prior both to matter and consciousness. And we have access to this. There's yet another form. We said, okay, what about neither mind and matter? What about both mind and matter? This, I think, is properly called dual aspect theory. Again, a theory that I think had fallen out of philosophical favor, but has now been making a serious comeback. A very recent book, Atmanspacher and Dean Rickles, is a modern and thorough defense of dual aspect theory. One of its champions, picked out because it's a little bit odd, is Wolfgang Pauli, a famous physicist and curmudgeon who strongly supported some kind of dual aspect theory. Working with Jung, the psychologist. This view is there is a single fundamental entity, it's a monism, a single fundamentality forming nature, and it has both mental and physical properties. And reality can be viewed, so to speak, from 2 points of view corresponding to the two aspects. Spinoza is maybe the most famous historic example of a dual aspect theorist, although technically he's an infinite aspect theorist. But he himself said we have only access to matter and mind. For Spinoza, each aspect is a perfect mirror of the other. You do not have to hold such an extreme form. I guess a kind of elegance to it. But roughly speaking, science takes the material point of view, experiential psychology takes the mental point of view. These are not ontological rivals because they are describing the same thing. Now, to finish up finally, there is another form, very recent, very speculative, very obscure, perhaps incoherent form, which holds that there is one thing. It is neither mental nor physical, but we know what it is. It's information. This can be associated with the physicist, maybe a little bit odd. He was another physicist who propounds this view. The physicist trying to look for some new way of looking at matter. Wheeler has this famous slogan, "It from bit." And I don't think anybody knows exactly what that means. The speculation is that information is somehow a basis for reality. It is somehow a kind of fundamental stuff, something like what neutral monists might be hoping to describe. But exactly how this could work, I find extremely obscure. Because whenever you think of information, you think about information being implemented in configurations of what? Of matter. Information theory is about how configurations of matter can transfer information. But the information itself remains kind of mysterious. You might say information is a mental feature somehow, feature we would call meaning or significance, maybe both semantic and pure significance. We would then have to understand what is the relation between information and computation. We understand computation in terms of the transfer theory of information, not in terms of this intrinsic. Or maybe there's something underlying both, right? Now, another person who might be thought is the physicist who name escapes me for the moment, but you guys will get it, who thinks that maybe consciousness is a new phase of matter. Max Tegmark. Maybe consciousness is some kind of new phase of matter, and this new phase is intrinsic information. I don't know anything about that. But I'm going to stop there rather than delve deeper because I've overstepped my time and completed my catalog. So thanks very much, and I look forward if you have any questions.